Hello everyone, welcome back to Abdo channel. As part of the Spring Boot annotation series, the annotations which we are picking for today's session are enable auto configuration and component scan annotations. Okay, let me start with the enable auto configuration annotation. What is the purpose of this annotation and why Spring team has developed this particular annotation? What is the background of the introduction of this annotation? We will start looking into that. Okay. Traditionally, to develop any Java-based application, like standalone application or database connectivity application, or any web application, around 15 years or 10, 12 years back, right? We used, suppose if we want to develop a database connectivity application, like to insert the records into a database, we have to configure the jars that are required to connect to that particular database libraries we have to configure in our project, and we also have to load the classes in the JDBC program, load the driver class, we have to mention the URL, we have to open the connection, we have to execute the statement, we have to close the connection, everything, right? So in order to connect to a program, to a database from our simple JDBC, plain JDBC program, we have to import the libraries that are required, and also we have to write a lot of boilerplate code like opening the connection, loading the driver class, closing the connection, executing the statements, and closing the connection. A lot of code we have to write. Similarly, if we have to write a web application that accepts a request from the internet client and provides a JSON response, then we have to configure a servlet in our web.xml file, and URL pattern, servlet config we have to mention, everything we have to mention in the web.xml file. Similarly, we have to add the servlet specific jar files when you are building the using the Tomcat application, when you are deploying the application in Tomcat server. The Tomcat specific libraries we have to add, right? So suppose if your application is responding with JSON response, then you have to add again the libraries specific to uh, JSON parsing and JSON libraries we have to add. So all these things we were doing for the lot of years. Okay, since uh, the moment Spring came into picture, right? Spring came into picture to avoid the lot of boilerplate code, and also one of the features of the Spring is dependency injection, inversion of control, everything, right? Along with that, it also came up with some template kind of patterns, okay, like JDBC template, WebMVC framework, and the ORM templates, everything. So those templates are helpful to avoid the lot of boilerplate code. Okay, while you are dealing with the JDBC, we are writing the code like loading the driver class, opening the connection, closing the connection. This is common every time you want to connect to a database, right? So those kind of operations will be are taken care by the Spring framework. Okay, you just have to mention what is the SQL you want to execute to that JDBC template or the ORM template. What is the query you want to execute? Okay, but you still have to uh, download or import the dependencies that are required to run your JDBC application or the web application. Okay, but the boilerplate code has been drastically reduced with the introduction of Spring. But the configurations, whatever we are doing for our application, right? Like dependencies, the external libraries, and the whatever we need for the application to config to run it in a normal standalone application or the web container, all those configurations are still there. This has reduced a little bit of time, little bit of development time, because of this uh, boilerplate is has been reduced. Boilerplate code has been reduced, but the configurations still we have to do. So then Spring Boot came into picture. You, as a developer, you don't have to bother about the configurations as well. I will take care of the configurations, and Spring Framework will take care of the boilerplate code. You just mention only on your business logic. Okay, you don't have to bother about the dependencies injection. You don't have to bother about the libraries injection. You don't have to bother about the configurations. You don't have to bother about the boilerplate. You just concentrate only on the business logic. Then, like for example, when you are developing a web application using servlets, you have to deploy the required jars for servlet, and if your application is responding with the JSON response, you have to mention all the JSON related parsing libraries, right? So all those libraries also will be, we have to add separately in your pom.xml if you are mentioning in the using the Maven. That is even we are doing when we are working with Spring. We have to mention each and every dependency in your pom.xml. But Spring Boot framework came up with another feature called dependencies. Okay, you starter dependencies. Okay, suppose if you mention a web application starter dependency, it will not only add the web related jars, but it also adds the uh, dependencies that are required to build a web application. Like any web application responds with the JSON libraries, any application needs some kind of logger related jars will also be added automatically. So Spring Boot framework came up with dependencies, starter dependencies. Okay, so they will be added based on the starter dependency you selected. Okay, that is the introduction about Spring Boot framework, why we needed the Spring Boot framework. But coming to this enable auto configuration annotation, right? So Spring Boot framework is taking care of the configurations automatically. You don't have to configure the servlet. You don't have to configure the uh, data source in order to connect to your database. Okay, you just provide the you just provide some properties that are required. So Spring Boot will take care of the creating web application servlet or the dispatcher servlet or the entity manager like this. Suppose if you want to connect to a database in Spring World, you have to mention the data source like this. We have to mention all the properties, and we also have to mention the entity manager like this, and we also have to mention the transaction manager. Okay, but all these configurations we have to do along with the dependencies. We have to add the libraries into our project. But the moment you add a Spring Data JPA starter dependency, right, the libraries will be added automatically, but the entity manager, transaction manager will not be created. Okay, in the earlier example we have seen, right, in the repository example, in our DAO class, we have created the entity manager and the transactional. Okay, this will be creating the transaction manager, right? So all this we have not created. Okay, these are created during your container startup. These classes are configured. These classes are automatically configured for your application the moment you add the data JPA starter dependency. Okay, so enable auto configuration is an annotation that is used to mention that I want the Spring Boot auto configure. I want the Spring Boot framework to auto configure the classes based on the libraries that I have added in my project. Say for example, I have added the data JPA dependency and I start my application. then Spring Framework looks at your pom.xml or your dependencies that are there in your class path like this. So if at all it is finding any web related jars, it will automatically configure the dispatcher servlet. Okay, if at all it is finding any MySQL related or the JPA related libraries, right? Like this JDBC libraries, ORM libraries. Okay, MySQL also we have added, right? Yeah. See this. If at all it is finding any libraries related to database like this MySQL, JPA, JDBC, then it will configure, it will automatically configure the classes like transaction manager, entity manager, data source, all those will be created. Okay, we just have to inject them. Spring Framework, we just have to auto-write them in our class. Spring Container will automatically inject the classes which are automatically configured during its startup. Okay, so the main purpose of enable auto configuration tag is to look at my class path jars and configure the required classes, startup classes, by looking at those jars. That is the main example or the main purpose of the enable auto configuration. Okay, let us start with a simple project. Okay, uh, auto configure. Okay, let me add the web dependency and data JPA dependency and MySQL dependency as well. Okay, I'm finishing the application creation. Now, the moment you add, right, those dependencies in your pom.xml, it is going to get the required libraries. Okay, MySQL library is there, JDBC library, ORM library, everything are there. Now, this is my launcher class. This is where the we start the Spring Boot application, right? This is my launcher class. Here it is by default annotating with the Spring Boot application. Let me remove this. We will talk about this annotation in the future videos. But let me add enable auto configuration because this is the class. It will be starting the Spring. It will be starting your container, right? So during the startup of my container, I want Spring Boot framework to take care of the auto configurations. So we will mention this class, this annotation on a class where it is starting your application. Okay, the moment you add this annotation, what will happen? We will see. Okay, we can see what all auto configurations are being done to your application by mentioning debug level to true in your application.properties. This gives us a report of what all auto configurations are being done, what all not being done, what all matches are done. By looking at it will look at the jars, and Spring Framework will look at the jars and uh, configure the classes, right? What all configurations it is doing, all those logs we can see by enabling this debug is equal to true in your application properties file. Okay, let me run it now, this application. Fail to determine. Yeah, see this. Fail to configure a data source URL data source. It is trying to configure the data source, okay, but it is not finding URL. Where did we specify to configure the data source? We have not specified anywhere, right? But Spring, the moment you specify the enable auto configuration annotation, Spring Boot looks at are the scans, the libraries that are present in your class path, as it is finding the data JPA and the MySQL dependencies. Then it is going to auto configure the data source, but it is failing to create it because we have not specified what database connection, what data source you want to connect. Okay, for that, let us take the properties which we have used in our previous project like this. Now if I specify these properties, it should be able to create the project. It should be able to create the container, and that data source will be automatically configured. Okay, see, this is the project, this is the report. Okay, I hope. Okay, now if you see this, this is the container startup log. And see this Hikari pool data source, Hikari data source is being created by the properties you mentioned in your property file. But who is mentioning to uh, create this Hikari data source? It is mentioned by the Spring Boot framework at the enable auto configuration, right? There should be one thing, Hibernate JPA auto configuration. See this Hibernate JPA auto configuration is there, Hibernate JPA configuration is there. See this, it is creating a data source. So if you want to see, it is matched, right? It is in the matched section. So the moment it finds the libraries, it is finding the library, and it is creating this configuration class and the data source class automatically. Okay. Suppose if you want to troubleshoot this, let's exclude this class from the auto configuration. Okay, we can exclude this. Exclude is equal to Hibernate configuration class. Okay, let me take this one, Hibernate JPA auto configuration. Okay. Now, if I run this program again, here we are finding this in the matched section, and it is creating the entity manager as well, right? Now, I have excluded that Hibernate JPA auto configuration from the auto configuration list. Now, if you see that in the exclusions, you are seeing Hibernate JPA auto configuration. Earlier, we have seen that in the matched section, right? In the exclusion list, it should be empty earlier. So, the moment you excluded the Hibernate JPA auto configuration, what happens we'll see. Earlier, we have seen the data source was created, right? Now we are not able to see it. See this? It is matched, but it is not creating any data source like this logger. We are not able to see it. See this? Here we are seeing Hikari data source and the connection pool was started creating and it is completed. But we are not seeing this logger here, right? Which means that the moment you exclude the Hibernate JPA auto configuration, it is not creating a data source, it is not creating an entity manager, everything it is not going to create. So this itself is a proof that enable auto configuration is making is scanning your class path and looking at the class path based on the libraries that are there or the classes that are there in your class path. It is initiating some kind of auto configurations. Suppose if you add the MySQL and the JPA dependencies, then it will start the Hibernate JPA auto configuration that in turn will create a data source. So as the data source entity manager are available when the moment you mention enable auto configuration, you can directly go and use them in your program the way we have used in our earlier program, right? Like this, you can go ahead and use it, entity manager and uh, transaction manager, everything. Okay. Now that we have seen data source, entity manager, transaction manager are being configured automatically by using the Hibernate JPA auto configuration class. The moment you specified at enable auto configuration annotation on your launcher class, right? That is one example how the Spring Boot is automatically configuring those classes by looking at the classes defined in your class path. We will see another example. Okay, now this is our pom.xml, right? So in our pom.xml, we have the web starter dependency. So the moment you add the starter dependency for web, all the dependencies that are required for building a web application, not only the web dependency, Spring Web MVC dependency, but also the JSON related, logging related, Tomcat web server, all those dependencies which are required for building the web application will be added automatically into your class path. But the moment you add at enable auto configuration, it will be configuring some of the starter classes that are required automatically for building your Spring Web MVC application. Okay, in any Spring Web MVC application, like for example, if you are building a Web MVC application without using Spring Boot, we have to configure a dispatcher servlet in our web.xml and the view resolvers. We have to mention the jar files location in our web.xml. Everything we have to mention without using Spring. But the moment you are switching to Spring Boot application and building a web application, it will automatically configure the dispatcher servlet. Okay, let's see that how the dispatcher servlet is coming into auto configuration with this example. Okay, now let's run this program. This will give us the auto configure report, right? Yeah. Let me take this log and search for the dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet. Yeah, see this dispatcher servlet auto configuration matched. It is creating a dispatcher servlet. Dispatcher servlet is a servlet which we usually configure that it is a front controller servlet for all the requests that are coming to your application to any controller. They will be routed via the dispatcher servlet, right, in a Spring Web MVC application. So that dispatcher servlet we have to configure manually. We have to configure the view resolvers if you are not using the Spring Boot. But the moment you are using the Spring Boot and mention the enable auto configuration and added the web dependency, it will scan your class path and finds the web related jars. Then it automatically creates the dispatcher servlet auto configuration and it will create the dispatcher servlet. So you don't have to configure anything now in your web.xml. You just have to use your controllers and the dispatch servlet automatically redirects the request to your controllers based on the URL pattern or URL path. Okay, so that's all about transact enable auto configuration. Now let me take up another annotation. What is this? This is component scan, right? Okay. Say for example, this is my application .java. Here I mention enable auto configuration. Okay, I have another class in the same package, that is employee. Okay, okay, I have another class that is employee in the same package. I annotated this class with that component. Okay, and this is just a bean. Okay, now if I run this class with a okay, let me run this class with a logging level, logging dot level dot org dot spring framework dot beans dot factory is equal to debug. Okay, so that we will see what all beans it is going to create. We know that in our previous videos we learned that at component is an instruction to the container to create a bean and manage its bean life cycle, right? We will see all those beans which are being created and managed by the container in the log if you enable this kind of logging, or the spring framework beans factory is equal to debug. Now I should be able to see the employee bean is being created during the container startup. Okay, let me run this. Okay, okay, let me comment this. We don't want the configurations, auto configurations report anymore. It should show all the beans that are being created. Okay, now let's take this. Let's check for employee. If the Spring container is creating an instance, we should be able to see a logger with this. Okay, but we are not seeing any logger because we have instructed the container to create a bean and manage the bean lifecycle by using that component. But we have not instructed the container scan for the classes. Okay, scan for the classes which are annotated with at component. Okay, which are annotated with at component, at service, at repository, at controller, at rest controller. So Spring container will always look for the classes to create the beans which are annotated with all these annotations: component, controller, service, repository, and rest controller. But in order to in order to create the beans, before instructing the container to create the beans, we have to instruct the container to scan for the classes which are annotated with all those annotations. Then we have to use the component scan. Okay, so at component scan is an annotation that is an instruction to the container so that it will scan for all the classes which are annotated with component, service, repository, controller, and rest controller, and bean as well. There is another annotation at bean. Okay, all those annotations classes it will scan and create it the moment you mention the component scan. Now let me run our program. The moment you mention component scan in your starter class or your launcher class, we should be able to see the employee object is created. See this, earlier we have not seen that, now we are seeing creating shared instance of singleton bean. So at component scan is working here in such a way it is giving an instruction to the container to scan for the classes that are annotated with at component, at service, repository, controller, rest controller, and bean. Okay, suppose if I annotate the class as at service, then also it will be creating a bean for this class. let's see the log. See this, even with that service as well, it is creating a bean for the class you mentioned with that service. So this is about at component scan. Okay, but there are some kind of attributes here to at component scan. Suppose if my launcher class is in the app package, but my my beans which are annotated with component and service are on the different packages. Okay, let me take another package here, com.app dot. Here instead of app, I mention beans. Okay, let's say I'm mentioning beans. So I will move this employee.java to from app package to beans package. Okay, the moment I modify the beans package of the employee.java from app to beans, what will happen we will see. Okay, again there is a problem, it is not creating it, right? So the root cause of this problem, why it is not creating at component scan, is always looks for the classes which are annotated with all those annotations which I mentioned before in the package which is similar to the class in which it is declared. Suppose if you are mentioning a component scan in one package, it will always look for the classes which are annotated with that component in that package only by default. Okay, that's why earlier as our employee is in the app package, it has created automatically because our employee.java and the application.java which is annotated with that component scan are in the same package. Now I taken that employee.java out of that app and moved it to the beans package. Now component scan is not instructing the container to create a bean for my employee.java. So even if it is outside of the package in which the component scan it is declared, if you want to instruct the container to scan the pack classes outside of the package, right? Then we have to use base packages. Okay, base packages is an attribute. If you mention com.appdev here, then let's see what happens. Com.appdev is the package. Suppose tomorrow you are having on another uh, package like business, you are having the employee business in it. So com.appdev.business will be the package for that employee business. So com.appdev will be common, should be common, right? Then we can mention that common package name as base packages for the components can attribute. So so that it is an instruction to the container, it will scan for all the classes mentioned in this base package. Now see this, it is again creating it even though it is in the different package because we mentioned the base packages where it has to scan for the component annotated classes. So at enable auto configuration, we discussed that it is an instruction to the container so that the Spring Boot will auto config scans the libraries or the classes that are there in your class path and auto configure the classes like JPA, Hibernate JPA auto configuration, dispatcher servlet auto configuration, all those auto configurations it will be doing it. We just have to use them, auto-wire them, and Spring Framework will automatically inject them in your required classes. At component scan, we discussed that it is an instruction to the container that it has to scan for the classes which are annotated with that component service repository controller, REST controller, and bean annotations in the package in which it is the component scan is declared or in the package that is specified in the base packages attribute. Okay, That's all we discussed for today. In the next video, we will talk about the some more annotations. Until then, thank you. Bye bye. Take care. Thank you for watching. Please give it a like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.